Okay, good evening to everyone. So we are continuing in our fabulous discussions of Yeshayahu. I'll just give a brief recap of the previous parak. We had finished last time before we went on our vacation. We had finished chapter 2. In chapter 2, it was the main message of Yeshayahu was that man will be humbled. In other words, we spoke about it in the context of the events of Yeshayahu's time. And again, we said these prophecies are all from the times of Uzziyahu, the king Uzziyahu. What was really unique about the times of Uzziah was that it was very similar to the times of Shlomo HaMelech. And we saw there was great success in the kingdom of Yehuda at the time. They were very successful financially. They had agriculture. They had international commerce, both by land routes that went through the south of the kingdom of Yehuda. They also had apparently port cities. It mentions that Uzziyahu had built port cities in Ashdod and in Eilat, so there was a lot of active international commerce going on. Military-wise, Uzziah had a very powerful army. He was conquering places. In other words, he was extending borders to the south. He had conquered cities of the Plishtim, of the Philistines. So military-wise, he was very successful. Diplomatically, international relations also, we saw Uzziah was very successful. He had other nations paying taxes to him. He became famous even to far away, as is mentioned in Divrei Yamim. We also saw at that time period also in up north in the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, also great success. Yeravam up north was also extending borders. So this was a very good time in terms of material things. In other words, a lot of wealth, a lot of borders being extended, a lot of military power. All of this, though, the result of this was, and we spoke about in the context of the prohibitions of the king, all of this led to various problems, which we'll now see discussed in the upcoming chapters. But sort of the primary one, which was described in chapter 2, was the rising of the heart, man's pride swelling his haughtiness, and therefore the first prophecy of Yeshayahu will be the humbling of man. All these wonderful ships and pleasures and etc. will all be taken away. Man will run down and to hide into caves, and man will be humbled before the Lord Hashem. Okay, now in the upcoming chapters, we're going to have sort of more specific details on what exactly this humbling is going to entail. Yeshayahu will provide more details. And also within that, all these prophecies of Yeshayahu, of this destruction, whatever exactly will occur that's going to come about, we're going to have more details about what were the sins that were going on. In other words, it's very nice to say there was a swelling of the heart, there was man's pride, they forgot God, etc. But what actually were they doing? What were the sins that were occurring? We saw a bit of it in chapter 1, that there were problems in the behavior of man to man, that the society was corrupt. So we'll see also more details of that in Yeshayahu. And as always, we'll have the very unique language of Yeshayahu, the very colorful and vivid descriptions that he gives, which we'll try to analyze a bit in depth as much as we can. Okay, so without further ado, we are going now to read the first half of chapter 3. Okay, and again, as I ask you, as always, when we read sort of a new section in Yeshayahu, to try to think about, you know, it's easy to get bogged down in the details, but we don't want to do that in our first stage. We sort of want to sort of get a structure in the mind of what Yeshayahu is saying. So I'm preparing you in advance that after we read these psukim, these verses, I'll ask you to try to come up with a sort of a structure of what Yeshayahu said, again, in general structure, before we get into the nitty-gritty details of what he's saying. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so we're going to read now Yeshayahu chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. So he says here as follows. Ki hineh ha'adon Adonai Tzevaot, Mesir biYerushalayim u'miYuda, Mash'en u'mashena, Kol mish'an lechem v'chol mish'an mayim. For lo, the sovereign Lord of hosts will remove from Jerusalem, from Judah, prop and stay, every prop of food and every prop of water. Again, the exact translation you can argue on, but mash'enu mashena, a mashen is like a stick, something that you lean upon, and it's also sort of a description for a leader, somebody who's in charge of something. So mash'enu mashena, kol mishan lechem v'chol mishan mayim, the one that's leading or in control of the bread and the one that's in control of the water. In other words, these will be removed. And now we're going to have a list of all the people that Hashem will remove from Yerushalayim and Yehuda. Okay? Gibor ve'ish milchama, shofet ve'navi ve'kosem ve'zaken. Soldier and warrior, magistrate and prophet. Augur, kosem is somebody who's using some sort of magic, and elder, zaken, elder. Sar chamishim unesu panim v'yoetz v'chacham charashim unevon lachash. Captain of 50, magnate and counselor. Nesu panim is sort of somebody who's very respectable, somebody that you give deference to. Yoetz, counselor. Chacham charashim, skilled artisan. Unevon lachash, expert enchanter. Okay, in other words, all this list of people will be removed. Okay? V'natati ne'arim sareihem v'ta'alulim yimshelu ba. And he will make boys their rulers, and babes shall govern them. In other words, young people, inexperienced, etc., not worthy of taking the positions of leadership. V'nigas ha'am ish be'ish v'ish bere'eu yirhavu hanar bazaken v'nikle b'nichmad. So the people shall oppress one another, each oppressing his fellow. The young shall bully the old, and the despised shall bully the honored. Ki yitpos ish be'achiv beit aviv, simla lecha, katzin tiyeh lanu, v'hamachshela zot tachat yadecha. For should a man seize his brother in whose father's house there is clothing, come, be a chief over us, and let this ruin be under your care. Yisa bayom hahu lemor, לא היה חובש, ובביתי אין לחם, ואין סמלה, לא תשימוני קצין עם. The other will thereupon protest, I will not be a dresser of wounds, with no food or clothing in my own house, you shall not make me a chief of a people. כי חשלה ירושלים ויהודה נפל, כי לא שונם ומעלליהם אל אדוני למרות עיני כבודו. Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen, because by word and deed they insult the Lord, defying his majestic glance. Hakarat pneihem anta bam, v'chatatam ki Sodom higidu lo chichedu. Oy lenafsham ki gamlu lahem ra. Their partiality in judgment accuses them. They avow their sins like Sodom. They do not conceal them. Woe to them, for they have served themselves. Imru tzadik ki tov. Hail the just man, for he shall fare well. He shall eat the fruit of his works. Woe to the wicked man, for he shall fare ill. As his hands have dealt, so shall it be done to him. Ami nogsav me'olel, v'nashim mashluvo, ami me'ashrayich mat'im v'derech ochotecha bileu. My people's rulers are babes. It is governed by women. O my people, your leaders are misleaders. They have confused the course of your path. Nitzava lariv Adonai v'omed ladinamim. The Lord stands up to plead a cause. He rises to champion peoples. Adonai b'mishpat yavo im ziknei amo v'sarav, ve'atem bi'artem akerem gzelat ani beveitchem. The Lord will bring this charge against the elders and officers of his people. It is you who have ravaged the vineyard. That which was robbed from the poor is in your houses. Malachem tedaku ami ufnei aniyim titchanu neum Adonai Elohim tzvaot. How dare you crush my people and grind the faces of the poor? says my Lord God of hosts. Okay, so we'll stop here. Again, this is half of chapter 2. Okay, so let's see what you were able to pick up from what we read. Let me start with a few questions. What essentially is Yeshayahu prophesying that is going to happen now?
That all the leaders and supposedly important people are going to be the ones that are going to go, and it's really the downtrodden people that are going to survive, and the just people.
Okay, very good. So in essence, what's being described here is, in other words, if we sort of want to hit the nail on the head, what exactly is going to be happening? It seems like all the leadership is going to be eliminated, right? That's what we have, this very long list at the beginning of various kinds of leaders. You know, we have the soldier, the warrior, the prophet, the magistrate, etc., etc. All of these are going to be removed. And essentially, what's being described here, let's say we take verses 4 and 5.
They will be replaced by people who are not capable of being, in leadership.
Yeah, so either it's people who are not worthy of being leaders, or it could be that essentially what's being described is even perhaps a form of anarchy, right? Yeah. Okay, now verses 6, 7, what's going on here? They're in essence, what's being described here in verses 6, 7.
They'll be between themselves. They'll be fighting. They'll be infighting.
In other words, here they're asking somebody, "Simla lecha katzin tieh lanu." In other words, you have clothing, therefore you should be our leader. In other words, what's the illusion here? What's the situation? Let's say materialistically, what's the situation at this time?
You look the part so you can take on the part, regardless of your talent or experience.
Yeah, in other words, there's a desperation. In other words, just the fact that you even have clothing, right? That's all we require, right? Okay, we don't need a very impressive resume. If you have a suit and tie, we're that desperate. You'll be our leader. And even that person who's asked, what's his response?
Refusal.
He doesn't want to be involved.
He says, I can't care for my family. I can't care for my home. You can't make me a leader of the people. I have no food or clothing in my house. I can't be a leader. In other words, there'll be a desperation. They'll lower the standards requirements just to get somebody appointed, and even that won't work out. Okay, so we can sort of say, just in terms of trying just to analyze the chapter, that verses 1 through 7 sort of describe what will happen. You know, the elimination of all positions of power and leadership, all will be gone. It will create a terrible anarchy. There will be a desperation to try to get anybody out there to take charge of the issues, and even that will not happen. Okay, that's sort of, very, generally what's happening in verses 1 through 7. Okay, now from verses 8, what do we have now? Here, to try and read what's on the screen and tell me what's going on from verse 8 onwards.
That the just shall rise and survive, and the evil shall do badly.
But in essence, what is the connection between this and what he had said previously? How does this tie into to his prophecy about the decimation of the leadership?
Well, Jerusalem and Judah have both fallen. In other words, the leadership has gone. They've been bad. They haven't done what they should have been. They haven't led as they should have led. Therefore, now it's going to filter its way down to the people who are just.
Right. In other words, in essence, this is the reasons why is God punishing the leadership and removing all the leadership? Because the corruption of the leadership has brought this about. Okay, this ties in. Let me ask you this. He mentions here in verse number 9, Chatatam kisdom. Their sins are like the sins of Sodom. Where else did Yeshayahu compare the people in his times to Sodom, to Sodom?
In that first verses that we read, you know, he said they were like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right. In chapter 1, he also said this. Kim'at ki Sodom ayinu. And he said, Shimu dvar Hashem k'tzinei Sodom, azinu Torat Eloheinu am Amorah. He compared them to Sodom and Gomorrah already in chapter 1, because again, they were corrupt, right? Partiality in judgment. And they have done this publicly without shame. Okay? He says, you know, the corruption, it's not just that God will punish you. In other words, the wickedness itself sprouts an evil result ultimately to the people who are doing it. The just man will receive the fruits of the good that he does, and the wicked man will receive the fruits of his wickedness. Okay? And this is what he speaks about. If you look here in verses 13, 14, he says God will stand up to do justice. Why? And he says very clearly in verse 14, Adonai b'mishpat yavo im ziknei amo v'sara v'atem bi'artem hakerem gzelat ha'ani beveitchem. The Lord will bring this charge against the elders and officers of his people. It is you who have ravaged the vineyard. That which was robbed from the poor is in your houses. In other words, he's saying, in essence, the leadership has been corrupt and they've been stealing from the people. Okay, that's why he's taking the leadership to task, and that's why he's removing all the leadership, because it was the leaders that have been corrupt. Rather than doing justice, they're the ones that are corrupt. They're the ones that are robbing the poor. Okay, right? How dare you crush my people and grind the faces of the poor, says my Lord God of hosts. In other words, although it seemed to us that this was a beautiful time of a great wealth, that wasn't exactly the case. All this wealth was being ravaged by these group of people in the higher parts of society. They were stealing it. It wasn't an open society where the wealth was spread out. They were consolidating the wealth on their own, and they were ravaging and stealing from the lower tiers of society. So in essence, the punishment is going to be removal of this whole upper tier of society of the leadership. All of that is going to be wiped out. Now, the result is not going to be good for anybody, as we saw in the beginning. It's not like, well, we've gotten rid of these group of people, and then everything is going to be wonderful for anybody. That's everybody. That's not what's being described here. In essence, it's going to bring about also a terrible result on its own of anarchy, right? That's what he's described in the beginning. But that's essentially the prophecy of Yeshayahu at this stage. We don't see yet where there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But in essence, if we sort of sum up the chapter very, concisely, we can say the upper tier in society, all these various functions of leaders that he's made in his list here at the beginning, all of these are essentially corrupt. They've been ravaging the poor, and there's this whole lower tier of society which is very poor and has been decimated by the corruption of the wealthy and powerful upper tier of society. Therefore, God is going to wipe away that whole tier of leadership, and it's going to result in the immediate situation that's going to follow that is essentially a society without any leadership, anarchy, the young oppressing the old, etc. They're going in their desperation. Apparently, there's also going to be some poverty, right? What we saw described about the person saying, I don't even have clothing and food from my own house. In their desperation, they're going to try to appoint somebody as the leader, and even that they're not going to be able to do. Okay, so that's sort of very broadly what Yeshayahu has described here. Okay, now let's try to go into some of the details. Okay, so the first thing we'll start off with is this. Again, in Yeshayahu, always the descriptions, they're very detailed. He's using a lot of imagery. Okay, so in this chapter, what is sort of the main sort of vividness, poetic vividness that he's using to describe what's going to happen? What do we have here?
Desolation.
What? If we look here at the beginning of the chapter,
A form of desolation. It's going to be terrible.
Yeah, but how is he describing this sort of complete destruction of the leadership? What literary technique is he using?
The Mishnah, the stay and the staff will be removed.
Yeah, in essence, he's produced here a very long list of apparently all people in these powerful positions in society. So he's got Mash'en, Mash'ena, Mishan Lechem, Mishan Maim, Gibor, Ish Milchama, Shofet, Navi, Kosem, Zaken, Sar Chamishim, Nesu Panim, Yoetz, V'chacham Charashim, Unevon Lachash. Okay, so he's got this very long list, okay, that he's going through, and he's saying all these people were removed. Okay, so what I want to do now is to try to analyze this list a bit more in detail and see what this whole list that Yeshayahu has produced here is about. Okay, so to try to understand this list, first we'll see what Chazal, or sages, the way they explain it, and they take one direction of trying to explain this list of Yeshayahu. After we see the explanation of Chazal, we'll try to analyze it, because the explanation of Chazal, as we'll see, is a bit more homiletical. It's not a simple explanation of the text. It's a bit more of a figurative explanation of the text, and then we'll go sort of to see more of the simple understanding of the text according to some of the other commentators. Okay, so let's start out with the Gemara. This is a Gemara in the Talmud in Masechet Chagiga, page 14a. Okay, and what's in here, the Gemara goes through these verses in Yeshayahu and explains them. Okay, so it says here as follows: Ki ata Rav Dimi אמר 18 קללות קילל ישעיה את ישראל, ולא נתקררה דעתו עד שאמר להם המקרא הזה ירבו הנער בהזקן והנקלה בנכבד. Okay, when Rav Dimi came from Israel to Babylonia, he said, Isaiah cursed Israel with 18 curses, and his mind was not calmed until he said to them the following verse: the child shall behave insolently against the age, and the base against the honorable. Okay, so the Gemara here sees in the words of Yeshayahu here in these verses 18 curses. Okay, now what are these 18 curses? 18 klalot ma'ininu. What are they? And then the verses that we read are quoted. Okay, so now we'll see how, and now the Gemara is going to go through this list and try to explain who each figure in this list of Yeshayahu is. Okay, so it says here as follows: Mash'en. I'll go through the Gemara quickly just to see. We will go through all the details, but just to see quickly what each one is. Mash'en, elu ba'alei mikra. Okay, so Mash'en, the Gemara interprets as referring to ba'alei mikra, the masters of the Bible, of the written Torah. Mash'ena, elu ba'alei mishnah. The Mash'ena is a reference to the scholars of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is essentially the halachot, the laws. Kol mish'an lechem. We won't go into how they justify this being as a reference to these specific scholars, but we'll just see the interpretation. Kol mish'an lechem elu ba'alei Talmud. These are the scholars of the Talmud. The Talmud being sort of the reasoning behind the halachot. Kol mish'an ma'im elu ba'alei agada. Ba'alei agada, the people of the Midrash, the people of the figurative interpretations of the Torah. Gibor ze ba'al shmot. Gibor is a reference to somebody who knows the master of the halachic traditions. Ish milchama, man of war. Ze sheyodeh lisav eliten b'milchamta shel Torah. Man of war, this is the one who knows how to engage in the discourse of Torah. Shofet ze dayan shedan din emet lamito. It is the judge who produces a true judgment. Navi kemashmo. Navi is the prophet. Kosem ze melech. Kosem is a reference to the king.
entirely of her physical and mental
Okay.
welfare.
שר 50, אל תקראי שר 50, אלא שר חומשים. זה שיודע לישא וליתן ב5 חומשי תורה. It is the one who knows chamashim. Chamishim is not 50, but rather it is chumashim, the master of the 5 chumashim, the 5 books of the Torah. Okay, nesu panim, זה שנושאים פנים לדורו בעבורו. It is the sage that for whose sake favor is shown to his generation. Okay, continuing in this list. Yoetz, who is the Yoetz, the counselor? שיודע לעבר שנים ולקבוע חודשים. The one who knows how to intercalate years and determine months. In other words, the person in charge of calculating and setting the calendar. The wise man, זה תלמיד המחכים את רבותיו. It is the student who makes his rabbis wise through questions. חרשים, what is חרשים? בשעה שפותח בדברי תורה, הכל נעשים כחרשים. It is the person that when he opens his mouth to speak Torah, everybody else becomes silent because they want to hear what he has to say. Unevon, זה המבין דבר מתוך דבר. It is the one who understands one thing from the other. לחש, זה שראוי למסור לו דברי תורה שניתנה בלחש. It is the one who is fit to teach him even the secrets of the Torah, those that are only usually taught in whispers. Okay?
Sorry, charushim, is that a play on the word plowing? I didn't get that one.
Charashim, no, the Gemara is interpreting it from the word of cherish, of being silent.
Oh, yes, okay, thank you.
Cherish also means silent. It's as though.
Okay.
Okay, all right. I think we've gotten the idea. If I'll ask you now, essentially, according to the Talmud, what essentially is this list of people all about? What is the characteristic of all these people that will be removed?
They're the leaders, they're the great sages, the Talmidei Hachamim.
Exactly. In other words, all these leaders that are mentioned here, essentially, according to the interpretation of the Talmud, is a reference to scholars of Torah. Okay? So this is very different. When we read Yeshayahu, we sort of understood it to mean as a reference to the leaders of society who were corrupt, right? As we see in the continuation of the chapter, and they will all be removed. The Talmud here is explaining it very differently, that all these people are very good people. They're all the Torah scholars, but in essence, this generation will lose all its scholars of Torah. Okay? So I think clearly it at least seems at first reading, for a number of reasons, that this is what we would call a midrash rather than a pshat. It's not the simple reading of the text for various reasons. First of all, the interpretations of the people here as being Torah scholars does not fit the simple reading of the text. For example, ish milchama means a person of war. It sounds like a military person. Okay, the Talmud is changing it to be somebody who knows to do milchamta shel Torah, how to argue properly in a discourse. Okay, so this is a very figurative explanation. Also, from the whole context, from the continuation of the chapter, it seems like these people were actually not following the Torah at all. They were very corrupt, and that's why they're being punished and removed accordingly. Okay, and the way the Talmud is explaining it is a removal of the good people, the scholars of Torah, and it's sort of a punishment to the nation or to that generation that they're losing all its scholars of Torah. Okay, so I think we could safely say this is sort of one of these homiletical explanations of Chazal. It's coming to maybe provide a certain message or a certain glimpse or a sort of a different interpretation of what Yeshayahu's message is, but it doesn't necessarily fit the simple reading of the text. Okay, so let's try to find in the commentators perhaps a more simple reading of the text. So if we look at the commentaries, we see, although they mention this interpretation of Chazal, most of them follow a more simple reading of the text, as we said, and actually does see these as actual leaders and people in positions of powers, but not necessarily scholars at all. Okay, so for example, let's see the Malbim. I didn't quote the Malbim in full in just the beginning, but I think he does if you read the Malbim, also continuation, you'll see this, but I just quoted the beginning. He says as follows, Ki hine, mesaper ech harva shemesh ha'uma bazman hahu. In other words, he's saying in essence, what's being described here is the setting of the sun at that point. In other words, there was this whole period of glory in the times of Uziyahu, and Yeshayahu is sort of saying how the great sun will set on this empire. In other words, all the people that will be removed here are essentially all different facets which are necessary for the completion of society. Okay, Yerushalayim ir hamamlacha, u'miYehuda mikol hashevet. Yerushalayim again is the capital city, and Yehuda is the entire tribe or the entire sort of nation state of Judah. Okay, Mash'en gadol u'mash'ena ktana ze derech klal. Okay, so just to understand what Yeshayahu is saying here, we go back to the verses. We'll see that it says here, Ine Hashem tzvaot mesir miYerushalayim mash'en u'mash'ena. What does it mean, mash'en u'mash'ena? So mash'en is a position of, it's like a stick or that you lean upon. Okay, so mash'en u'mash'ena is sort of figurative. Mash'en is the big leader, the big positions of power, and mash'ena is the smaller positions. In other words, this is sort of a title for this list. Okay, Mash'en u'mash'ena is a title for this entire list. This entire list will have positions of very powerful positions in the hierarchy of leadership of society, and also some smaller positions as well. And Mash'en u'mash'ena is sort of not part of the actual list, but it's rather a title head for the following list. In other words, Yeshayahu is telling you, I'm going to tell you all the positions of power and leadership that will be removed, some of them very large and very powerful, some of them lower positions, but still in the hierarchy of power. All of these were removed. And from here begins the list. Okay, so now,
Rav?
Yeah.
And he mentioned the water also.
Yes,
The property of water.
yes, correct.
There is a link between water and Torah. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, that's the figurative explanation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but on number 10, on the number 10 chapter, he says that normally people who act rightly, they have to get the fruit of their work.
Correct.
So that means that in the corruption, they were able to diverse, like the water, the sense of the things. Maybe.
Again, if you're following the interpretation of the Talmud, then the Mish'an Maim is a reference to a form of Torah scholars.
Yeah. Because
If you're following the simple explanation of the verses, as we'll see, then Mish'an Maim is referring to the person who's in charge of the water. Okay,
Yeah.
The person who's in charge of the water, even nowadays, but certainly in the times of an agricultural society, it's very funny. I don't know if you follow Israeli politics, but there was a minister of water who resigned recently. Okay, and everybody was joking about it. Oh, we're not going to have water in the faucets, etc. In essence, they were ridiculing this whole position of the Ministry of Water, but and rightly so, perhaps. But if you think about it, especially in the agricultural society, the person who's in charge of the water is a very powerful position in the economy. Even at least I don't know how it works in the UK, but in Israel, not the minister of the water, but the water company of Israel is very powerful. They can demand whatever their union of workers. I don't know if you have that same situation in the UK, but it's one of the most powerful workers unions in Israel. If they shut down the faucets, nobody will have any water. So it is a position of power, of economic power, who's ever controlling the water. Okay, so that seems to be a more simple reading of the Mish'an.
And the chapter 10?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The chapter 10?
The verse number 10, you mean?
Yeah, the verse number 10.
Verse number 10 is sort of where he says about the Imru tzadiki tov kifrim alalem yochelu. Hail the just man, for he shall fare well, he shall eat the fruits of his works. This you're referring to?
Yeah.
This is just sort of a general statement of Yeshayahu, that the just man will receive the fruits of his work, which will be positive. In other words, if you do good, good will come back to you. The wicked man, ill shall fare to him. In other words, what Yeshayahu is trying to describe, that the wickedness that they have done, this result, it's not just simply that, oh, you've done wickedness and God will punish you. If you do bad in the world, the bad will come back to you. In other words, Yeshayahu is trying to describe that it's not sort of the way the world is built, that if you do wickedness, ultimately that wickedness will come back to you. And wickedness will happen to you. This is a general theme in Tanakh, that it's not just that God punishes the wicked. The way the world is built, if you do wicked, in other words, corruption between people, ultimately that will hit you back. It's like if you dig in Sefer Mishlei, Chofer Gumatz bo yipol. If you dig a hole in the ground, you will fall into it. Okay, it's sort of a general moral statement of Yeshayahu on their wicked behavior.
Yeah. Diane Livner, I just want to say, the previous speaker, I know what he's saying, because I'm in the Parashat Nitzavim, when it says you're all standing here describing all the Bnei Israel, from the water drawer to the carrier, and many of the Meforshim will tell you they are the Talmidei Hachamim.
Again, that's an allegorical explanation.
Exactly.
Okay, we're trying now that there is that. It's, there are different levels in the understanding of the text. The simple understanding of the text is at least you were referring to. Okay, so now we're short on time. So let's now try to analyze the list of Yeshayahu. Okay, so basically, if we take out the Mashen and Mashena, as the Malbim said, which is the title for this list, okay, just it says big leaders and small leaders, then in essence, what we have, if we take the rest of the list, we can break it down into 13 leaders. Mish'an Lechem, Mish'an Maim, Gibor Ish Milchama, Shofet, Navi, Kosem, Zaken, Sar Chamashim, Nesupanim, Yoetz Chacham Charashim, and Nevon Lachash. Okay? Now, what I've tried to do is to try to group this list into categories. And this is what I've come up with. Mish'an Lechem, Mish'an Maim, 1 to 2, the person in charge of the bread and in charge of the water, it's referring to the economic leadership, okay? Bread and water. It's a reference to the people in economic positions of power. Okay, that's relatively simple to see. Gibor and Ish Milchama, 3 and 4. Gibor is the hero, the warrior. Ish Milchama, the man of war. That's referring to the military leadership. Okay, now we have very interesting 5 through 8. Shofet is the magistrate, the judge. Navi is the prophet. A shofet also could be like we have the book of Shoftim. It could be sort of the person who leads the nation. Navi is the prophet. Kosem is the magician. We'll speak about him soon. What's this about? And Zaken is the elder. Okay, these are all what I would call manigim shel klal u'ma, national leadership. These are leaders on a national scale. In other words, they lead the entire tribe, the entire state, the entire people. Then 9 through 13, we have Sar Chamishim. Sar Chamishim literally is the minister of 50. In other words, it's a leader of a smaller group of people. Nesupanim is somebody who you give deference to, that you respect. Okay? Yoetz is a counselor. Could be somebody, maybe the justice department or something of the sort. Chacham Charashim is a type of wise man. And Nevon Lachash, also somebody, some sort of person with some knowledge, some intuition. He knows the incantations, the whispers. It all seems to be a reference, all these groups of 9 through 13, to be more a leadership, but on the more local, lower level type of leadership. Okay, local leadership, advisors. This is the group of 9 through 13. Could be people we either work under the national leaders in lower tier positions, or perhaps more local leaders, what you would call maybe nowadays the city council, or these type of positions. Okay, so I think if we sort of break it down, again, we have the title head of Mash'enu Mashina, Mash'en, the big leaders, Mashina, the small ones. And then we see sort of 1 through 8 are the big ones. We have the ones on the economic matters. We have the military, people in the army, leaders of the army. And then we have the national scale leaders, the prophet, the judge, the elder, and the kosem, the magician. We'll speak about soon what he's about. Actually, maybe not tonight, maybe next week. And then we have the more minor leaders of Sachamishim, local minor leaders. All of these will be removed. That essentially is what Yeshayahu is prophesying here. Okay, now let me ask you a question. Okay, so I'll just say briefly, we won't have time to do this full enough in detail. We'll pick this up next week. But if we take a look at, I'm sorry about that, Numbers 5 through 8. Okay, 5 through 8, I said they're all leaders of the nation. Okay, here we have a very interesting situation, which we've pointed out numerous times already, that Yeshayahu is using phrases and expressions directly from Sefer Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy. And this is what we have here. These 4 people are all mentioned in Sefer Dvarim in near proximity to one another. Okay, this is all in chapters 17 through 19 in the book of Dvarim. We have the Shofet mentioned there, the Shofet Asher Yeh Bein Hayamim Hahem in Dvarim chapter 17. We have the Navi, the prophet. We have the Kosem, it says there, the Kosmim. And the Zaken, we also have the elders mentioned. Okay, so all of these leaders, these national leaders, what I called, are all mentioned in Sefer Dvarim, and you can see very clearly Yeshayahu is sort of going through the chapters in Sefer Dvarim, and he's mentioning them on his list here: the Shofet, the magistrate, Navi, the prophet, the Kosem, the magician, and the Zaken, the elder. Okay, now let me ask you the following question, and we'll end with this: which one on this list does not seem to fit? What is the surprising one mentioned on this list?
The Kosem, the magician.
Kosem, right. Why is the Kosem surprising? Very good, Flora.
It's, we're not allowed to deal in magic. It's in Isur, it's a prohibition in the Torah.
Very good. The Shofet and the Zaken, they're the people that we want, right? That's what the Torah describes in Sefer Dvarim. We need a Shofet, we need a Navi, we need a Zaken. Kosem, we're not allowed to have. We should get rid of them. Now, Yeshayahu is making a prophecy of destruction. Bad thing is going to happen. We're going to lose all these people. Okay, so everybody else here, you're right, it's a big loss. We don't want to lose these people. We need these people in power. But the Kosem, what is Yeshayahu coming and tell us? Oh, I'm going to remove the Kosem. Good riddance. We want him gone. We don't. The Torah prohibits these Kosmim. Good riddance. So how does the Kosem fit in a prophecy of Yeshayahu, which is, again, it's supposed to be a terrible prophecy of punishment, and he said, we're going to remove the Navi, we're going to remove the Shofet, and we're going to remove the Kosem. Well, if you're going to remove the Kosem, good. We've been trying to get rid of him for years of these Kosmim. That's what the Torah commanded us to do. Why is that a bad thing?
Well, because they were actually there at the time. In other words, they hadn't been removed,
Okay.
that they were allowed to be there.
So is it good or bad that they're being removed?
No, it's bad that they were there. And why hadn't they been removed by all the Shoftim and everyone else?
But again, Yeshayahu, okay, so you're saying there were Kosmim at the time. You're definitely right. There were Kosmim, because otherwise you couldn't remove them if they weren't there. But I'm saying if Yeshayahu is describing a prophecy which seems to be something terrible is going to happen, why is this terrible? This is good. All the other lists, I understand, it's all terrible. That this is a tragedy that all these people will be removed. But the removal of the Kosem is a good thing. It's like an anticlimax to the prophecy of Yeshayahu.
Yeah, but the good people hadn't removed the soothsayers. I mean, they hadn't done it. They'd allowed them to be there.
So you're saying it's sort of hinting that there was a bad situation to begin with, that these people were still around.
Yes.
Okay, all right, could be. So next week we'll pick up on this. I'll try to make another possible suggestion as to what Yeshayahu, and we'll also see some further analysis on this prophecy of Yeshayahu. Okay, we'll stop here, and I'll leave you to